morning. Barry Ladendorf, President of the Board of Directors, Veterans for Peace. By all accounts, the people that I've run into in the last 3 or 4 days, we've done a good job with this convention. People seem happy with it. Am I right about that? Yeah. All right. Well, next year, Chicago, we're going to try to keep this kind of quality up, and that'll be the goal next year as we see you all in Chicago. So in the closing today, we had it looks like we're going to have a little bit of an abbreviated agenda. We had hoped to have one of the Kids for Peace. And I don't know if you know what that organization is, but it started in San Diego. It's a worldwide organization now of 5 million kids across the globe that have organized into groups and chapters, and they struggle for peace, and they go into schools and they talk about tolerance, and so it's a great program, and they do marches around each year. They go a place to do a march, and next year we've been talking with them about coming to Chicago to have their annual march in Chicago and join Veterans for Peace. Can you imagine Veterans for Peace, Kids for Peace in the city of Chicago fighting militarization of not only the police, the schools, but our whole society. So next year, we expect to have them here and be able to be spokesmen and give us a perspective of what the kids are doing around the world. But it just missed out on it this year. Their leader is in Kenya right now, organizing over there. They have chapters in Palestine and all across the world and across the states, trying to get into schools, trying to talk to kids about fighting against bullies and things like that. You know, trying to put a good example of acceptance and tolerance. Mac Chin, is Mac Chin here in the audience? He is on the list. He's a representative from Barbara Lee's office. Barbara Lee, we tried to get her before, after, she just wasn't available, but they were going to send in Max Chin from the office to read a statement. I don't see that he's been here. So we'll have we'll move ahead without that. And I don't think there's any doubt that Daniel Ellsberg, who's going to be our principal speaker, can fill in the spaces if we have anything. I don't have no idea. Okay. I don't know. I never heard about this. I just looked at what was here. No one ever told me that. We can sing afterwards. It's fine. Right? Or do you want to? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Okay. Well, so I'm told, is Peter Tracy, are you here? Okay, come on up here. I understand that he's been added to the agenda. That'd be great. So we'll have a brief song, and then we'll introduce Daniel Ellsberg. And Daniel, are you right there? Okay, just a second. We're going to have a song, and then you're going to come up.
Howdy. I saw Daniel Ellsberg a couple of weeks ago, and at the Progressive Festival at Petaluma, and he inspired me to write this little ditty. And it's not going to go over well with Latvia, but this is like we're faced with this really shitty choice, and that's what we're faced with. And it's one or the other, and that's what this is about. All right. Say what? It ain't about Jill Stein. It ain't about Jill Stein. No. Sorry. She ain't gonna win. Well, we're gonna raise a fuss. We're gonna raise our voices. 'Cause this election year, we don't like our choices. Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, you get a neocon hawk or a fascist chump. Sometimes I wonder what we're gonna do, but there ain't no cure for election year blues. Well, I'm really downhearted and I feel disrespected. because I worked real hard to get Bernie elected. Now WikiLeaks tells us what we already know. The fix was in a long time ago. They rigged the game so Bernie would lose. Now I'm really disappointed with election year blues. Donald's plan to save America doesn't hold water. And who would trust a president who wants to date his daughter? His romance with Putin is a mystery. When the romance ends, it could be World War III. His finger on the button with a very short fuse. I'm tired of election year blues. He's a little Mussolini with very bad behavior. And a messiah complex, he thinks that he's a savior. But if you're a minority, a woman or queer, remember the Supreme Court appointment next year. Someone like Scalia would be Donald's nominee. I think I'll hold my nose and vote for Hillary. Hold your nose. Whew. All right.
Okay, so we're going to move right into the main speaker today. Of course, Daniel Ellsberg needs no introduction, but I'm going to do a brief introduction anyway. Daniel Ellsberg is a former military analyst who is best known for his part in the 1979 release of the Pentagon Papers, the top secret study of the decision-making process of the U.S. government during the Vietnam War. And if you haven't read his book, Secrets, a memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers, I highly recommend it. It's a terrific book. You can't put it down once you start it, but I recommend that to you highly. He's also the subject of a film, and I think it came out not too long ago, maybe in the last few years, called The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. Very much, you ought to be, try to find that if you can. So a little bit of background, Daniel was a United States Marine Corps officer. He worked for the RAND Corporation, the Defense Department. He's graduated summa cum laude from Harvard in 1952, received a PhD in economics from Harvard in 1969, and studied later at Cambridge. Daniel is a member of Veterans for Peace, a member who serves on the Veterans for Peace Advisory Board, one of our heroes, one of the great war resistors. Let's give a warm Veterans for Peace welcome to Daniel Ellsberg.
Thanks very much. Well, when Paul Cox told me some time ago that what he hoped I would add at the closing plenary here was hope. And at first, I almost begged off the possibility at all. As you just heard from the terrific song, The Election Year Blues, who here has not got election year blues? Do I see any hands? We're facing probably the worst pair of candidates that I can say I've seen in my lifetime, the worst Democratic candidate, the worst Republican candidate. I do feel, as the song indicated, that one is even worse significantly than the other. But since I live in California, and a lot of you do, I don't have to vote for Hillary Clinton, no reason at all. I'm not going to focus on the election year, though. And I would say if I were in a swing state and it were close, which it looks, fortunately, it may not be. If it were close, then I'd have to face a different judgment. But because I do think it is important to keep Trump out. But it looks as though he's keeping himself out at this point. That's the good news. And for a very interesting reason, particularly for me. That's what I'm going to come to. somebody told me that after one of my lectures long ago, and I hadn't realized there was such a pattern, he overheard two people on the way to the lecture on a college campus saying, what do you expect from Ellsberg to hear from him? And the other guy said, well, there'll be some good news and some bad news. And, Moses came down from the mountain with the tablets, and somebody said, well, what's the word? He said, well, there's good news and bad news. He said, I got him down to 10, but adultery is still in. Okay, well, some of the things that are not in, rather strikingly, from those commandments 3,500 years ago. War is not, a forbidding of war is not in the Ten Commandments. Murder, yes. Slavery, no. Racism, no. Genocide, no. Not one of the commandments. Torture. We're talking, you heard a moment ago that an issue before us is to regain our humanity, to define our humanity. But all the things I've just said, which are not forbidden in the commandments 3,500 years ago from the Hebrews' God, are part of humanity. When I hear people saying that to torture is not American, as Obama told us, as Chelsea Manning revealed, he was in the process throughout his administration here of handing people over to the Iraqis, knowing they would be tortured, as clear-cut a violation of our international and domestic obligations and laws, as torturing them ourselves, actually. So torture is, and of course he failed to prosecute anyone for torture. The one person who revealed a torturer, John Kiriakou, the messenger, was sent to prison for 30 months. And by failing to prosecute anybody for that, he effectively decriminalized torture, which he can't do, actually, in terms of international law, but for practical purposes he did. And he set a precedent there that undoubtedly his successors will follow. But I'm drawing this point. The point is, torture is not American. No, wrong. No, mistake. Turns out that's mistaken. Well, I say all these things tend to define inhumanity. But as a matter of fact, what is more human? What is more human than to torture, enslave, war, massacre, mass murder? No other animal does that. We're the one that does. Helen Caldicott said the other day, we are an aberrant species. Well, it's not clear what that could mean. All species, most species, nearly all of them have gone extinct by this time, long ago, because they didn't fit their environment, their rivalry. What does it mean to be aberrant? But in any case, we are an exceptional species, almost unique. No other species, except some species of ants, commits war, group violence against other groups of their own species, or murder on the same scale. And when it comes to enslavement and torture, again, unique. We're the species that does that. That's something we have to recognize, I think, and deal with. Is there immediate hope for some of these changes, like war? We heard from the bad news. We heard the bad news from the three or four speakers the other night at the plenary. How many people were here to see Basevich, Caldicott? Nearly everybody. So I don't need to go over all that. I would like to be able to say that I see hope, strong hope for changing any of those characters. We heard from Caldicott about nuclear war, which I do want to focus on tonight. Basevich from eternal war, and Scranton from the prospects for climate change. As he put it, it is inescapable that there will be catastrophic climatic change at that point. Am I here then to contradict any of that? No. Fortunately, I know I'm talking to a very unusual audience. How many are veterans here? Not all of you, but very good. Nearly everybody. That's, as we recognize, for an unusual group of people to speak to each other. People who have not only been veterans, but are here by virtue of the fact that we've learned better in some ways than we knew when we were in. Saw a lot of hands here just now. Let me ask, as a matter of fact, anybody here a veteran of World War II? Really, very good. I would never have guessed that. Okay, how about Korea? Korean War period. Not too many. Am I the oldest person here? 85? Who? Oh, so you had to be. Okay. And how many from Vietnam? A lot. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Iraq? A few. Very good. Afghanistan? Okay. What's that? One of the undeclared wars. I wasn't going to, that's a footnote. Okay. Anybody? Sudan? Yemen? Okay. Which of you was not lied into war? What's that? Which one was that?
I went to Vietnam knowing it was
I'm sorry? In Vietnam.
I went to Vietnam knowing it was stupid.
Okay. Okay. I would say it's very hard to find a war since 1945. I happen to think I'm not a total pacifist. I wasn't when I was in the Marines. I'm not now. I look back on, and I have arguments with friends of mine, and very, very respected and loved friends like Howard Zinn and others, who have concluded that even World War II could not be justified. I argue with them on that. I think the Russians who fought against the Nazi invaders with arms and with tanks, and refused to give in the face of what seemed like hopeless situation, were right to do so, and that we were right to help them. And the British, who shot at planes that were coming over London, dropping bombs on London, were right to fire at them, not just justified, but it was the best thing for them to do. And again, their cause seemed to many people, including John F. Kennedy's father, the ambassador to Britain at that time, that their cause was hopeless. And yet they went on, they did fire, and it turned out it wasn't hopeless. Okay, I think that was justified, and our aid and our involvement in that was justified, in my opinion. Looking back, Korea, in which I volunteered after 2 deferments, but I volunteered on the grounds that we were resisting aggression. It seemed to me justified. It was a UN operation, although dominated by the US. But whether that was worthwhile, worth burning down every structure, every town in North Vietnam with our Air Force, creating a chaotic situation there, which surely influenced the police state tyranny that followed in North Korea to this day, in favor and so forth. And in terms of what that led to justifying, in terms of a huge buildup and the nuclear buildup afterwards, I wish we had not, in fact, involved ourselves in that war. Going since then, which war has seemed justified? Justified. Did not require lies to get us into. We'll make a case for the Gulf War, actually, under Bush to some degree. But we know what that led to, ultimately. Bush's son, later doing the job right, doing it better in Iraq 10 years later, and the disaster that we see today. Okay. So what's the bad news, as I say, is that we have 2 candidates, and I will not pretend that one of them is better than the other in terms of changing this eternal war situation, or at least I will not claim that Hillary is that person. I think quite on the contrary. In fact, if I believed what Trump was saying about not wanting to intervene in various places, wanting to be friendly with Russia, a genuinely promising thing, I think, which is a difference in this campaign. Actually, weird as Trump looks, in the last 2 campaigns, I could not identify a single thing on which McCain or Romney looked more promising or sounded more promising on any issue that I could look at. Oddly enough, that's different with Trump. What he's talked about, not sending lethal aid to Kiev in the Republican platform, getting a war in Ukraine with the Russians on that. Working with the Russians on Syria, actually, good proposal. Obama may be doing that. Want to be friendly with the Russians in general. A number of things on foreign policy. Critical of NATO, saying NATO is obsolete, and it's worse than that, dangerous at this point as an exclusive alliance against Russia, the new Cold War that is heating up. He actually sounds better on that point. But then I have to reflect that George W. Bush sounded better than Gore when he campaigned. I didn't vote for George W. Bush, but I remember hearing him deny the idea of humanitarian intervention that Gore was espousing, and saying he wanted a more compassionate, softer, more humble foreign policy. That actually sounded better. Well, I'm not sorry that I didn't vote for Bush on that point, because that promise, was worthless. It turns out. So this does not incline me toward Trump. What are we left then with Hillary? Every prospect of wars ahead. She appears more hawkish than her husband, more hawkish than Carter, more hawkish by far than Obama. In fact, you really have to go back far to see somebody who seems as militaristic as a candidate. You have to go back to, say, Goldwater, or conceivably McCain on the Republican side. So that is not where I look to for hope, and what does that offer us? Well, I'll come back in a moment, because curiously enough, on one issue at least, there is some current, very recent hope in the next 5 months, and it does call for political action on our part. Let me mention one other, though, that's suggested by one.
Test.
Sorry, that's funny. What? Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I was glad to hear Chelsea Manning mentioned, but there's something that needs to be added there. Can you hear me? Yeah. How many people here are not aware that Chelsea Manning, as of the last couple weeks, is facing 4 new criminal charges in prison? How many people didn't know that? Let me see. Okay, about half. So for all of you, just make it clear, as you know, it is public, she attempted suicide on, I think it was July 5th, and which told me that Chelsea Manning is, after all, human. She's not superhuman. A woman in a man's prison facing 35 years, who shouldn't be in prison at all, is capable, is vulnerable to the depression, and the despair that I think makes it very clear that she's human, reacting, and that she needs our help. Now, she's happy that she's alive, that she was found unconscious in her cell and removed on a stretcher and treated better. But she's not getting much treatment now, as a matter of fact, and recently just was hit with 4 new charges. And one of them was resisting the cell movement force that came in. Very interesting charge, since she was carried out on a stretcher, unconscious, resisting. Threatening to harm herself, apparently. Prohibited substance, the one that she was used in attempting to kill herself, to end her life. So these bizarre, charges, and which could add 9 years to her sentence and threaten to put her in solitary confinement for the remainder of her sentence, which is, 35 or 40 years. Now, so 115,000 signatures were delivered from Roots Action and some other things to the Department of the Army, Secretary of the Army, just last week. And it's not too late to add your names to those appeals, to drop these charges, these inhumane charges. And that's an immediate thing. The ACLU is helping her, but that is something people can do and should do. Tell Obama and Secretary of the Army, the head of the prisons and whatnot, this is outrageous and obscene, and these charges must be dropped, and they are serious. That's something you could do. Second, you heard me say, if you were at this meeting the other night, that I personally do not believe that a pardon is going to happen for under any president I can foresee in the face of intelligence community resistance. For my friend Ed Snowden, a campaign to pardon him is undoubtedly worthwhile to in a number of ways politically, but not with the expectation that it will be successful. It's a good organizing tool. However, a pardon for Chelsea Manning, who has now served 6 years in prison, a large part of it already in solitary confinement, is very much worthwhile and in the works. And although that's unlikely to happen during the campaign, President will still be have plenty of time up till not only Christmas Eve, but right up till January 20th. In his end-of-term pardons, he should pardon Chelsea Manning. He should pardon Jeffrey Sterling, who is rather despondent also and in very bad health, who revealed CIA abuse. And for that matter, retrospective pardons for John Kiriakou, Tom Drake, and others. So that is a campaign that's one thing I can say that is worthwhile, and I would say has some chance of succeeding, unlike, say? I can't hear well enough, I'm sorry. Again, that's fine. Yeah, fine. No, what can I say? That's been should have happened many years ago, every year, et cetera, et cetera. I wanted to give you an actual pardon that I think could actually take place, and I'm not trying to be pessimistic about that. I'm just saying this is positive. Chelsea Manning could and should be pardoned at the end. She has served 6 years, which she shouldn't have had to serve at all. But with all this, that's, I think, something to think about. Okay, I mentioned that I want the subject that is closest to my own work currently and before and after I worked on Vietnam, and that's the one that Helen Caldecott talked about, which is nuclear war. And those of you who are in Vietnam, by the way, which is a lot, were not aware that you were in a nuclear war. But you were, and I'll get to that. And some of you may have been aware, but I think it's a small minority. A nuclear war, obviously, well, I said the chance that either Hillary or Trump, well, Hillary in particular, will change our risks on nuclear war is low to nothing. And I want to make some distinctions here about what I think the odds are. As I say, I think the odds are different for Chelsea Manning pardon and for Ed Snowden pardon or Leonard Peltier. And these distinctions are worthwhile. And I know that I'm talking to an audience that will not be moved. I won't be accused of moving you to end the struggle if I just tell you that the odds of certain things are very, very low. Everything we do, and certainly everything I do, is in pursuit of very, very low odds, and some are lower than others. And we take that into account. A hopeful thing on the nuclear issue is that for the very first time since 1964, the Goldwater campaign, a candidate has made himself so appearing to be, as a candidate, so appearing to be frivolous and uninformed and reckless on nuclear weapons as to be an actual issue in the campaign. That has not been true for the last half century since Goldwater. It is true right now. And the last time it was really discussed as a major issue, nuclear weapons, were under Reagan, when he scared people but on nuclear weapons and raised the Freeze campaign. But that was under a president who had it at that point. It was too late to move him, and actually it was we were unable really to get him to do what we hoped, which was to stop the arms race, which went on unabated until the end of the Cold War. Okay. Thanks to Trump, as I say, and I do thank him on this, not sarcastically, that issue has suddenly arisen in the public mind, as it should have been for a long time, right now. The fact that it's in a campaign is not as hopeful as it might be. It will send people to Hillary, but not with an honest basis for hope. It will be based at best. Going to Hillary on this issue is delusional. The point is that Trump answered the question of Chris Matthews some time ago, actually, on the possibility of his using nuclear weapons. And that caught attention. Hillary, back in June, said this is a person too thin-skinned to be trusted with control of nuclear weapons. And she said it again at the convention. Scarborough then, just 2 weeks ago, August 3rd, Joe Scarborough revealed that Trump had raised the question in a briefing on nuclear weapons several times, 3 times. Why can't we use them? If we've got them, why can't we use them? And that recalled to people the Chris Matthews interview, which had led to this exchange. Which had led to this exchange. Trump says, why are we making them? Why do we make them? Matthews gives a wrong answer, actually. He says, because of the old mutual destruction. Trump, I was against Iraq. I'd be the last person to use the nuclear weapon. Matthews, so can you take it off the table now? And Trump says, well, that's sort of like the end of the ball game. Can you tell the Middle East we're not using a nuclear weapon on anybody, says Matthews. Trump, I would never say that. I would never take any of my cards off the table. Matthews, how about Europe? We won't use it in Europe? I'm not going to take it off the table. You might use it in Europe? No, I don't think so. But I'm not taking it. Well, just say it, says Matthews. I will never use a nuclear weapon in Europe. Trump, I'm not taking cards off the table. I'm not going to use nuclear, but I'm not taking any cards off the table. Okay. Well, it sounds that worried people, and that brought Chris Matthews thing in, except that what really has raised this issue simply was that Trump has been asked the question in this campaign at last, which is not at all typical. What would Hillary say if she were asked the question, which I don't know whether I want her to be asked or not, but let's ask, what would she say? Well, that question did come up in 2008 when she was running against, actually in 2007, in the early stages of the campaign with Obama. And Obama had said something that no president has ever said, even for some circumstances. He had said nuclear weapons, they asked him about would he use them in Afghanistan or Iraq, just like this question now about the Middle East. And he said, it's off the table. Nuclear weapons are off the table. I cannot imagine any circumstances in which I would use it in Iraq or Afghanistan against those people. I'm sorry, Pakistan, a nuclear state. So he said, okay, and supposedly an ally, I would not use nuclear weapons against Pakistan. At which point, people who were with Hillary as she watched that on the television reported that they saw her smile against her rival, and she had him on that, and called a press conference and said, no president should ever tell an opponent whether he or she would or would not use nuclear weapons. Should not say that. She thought she had him on that. Well, she didn't win on that issue anyway, but she hasn't been asked that. I think we can say what she would answer if she were asked the same questions here. Trump, in fact, was giving the answer that any presidential candidate, in terms of across the board, will you use them first under some circumstances? They would all feel compelled and would say, yes, exactly what Trump said. He wasn't departing from administration orthodoxy, bipartisan orthodoxy on this. That is our policy, to threaten first use and even first strike preemption under various circumstances. And our weapons are designed for that and nothing much else. Our ICBMs, for example, cannot really survive a first strike by the other side in their silos unless they are launched on warning, which we are prepared to do with radar warning and satellite warning. Our plans are prepared to launch them against ICBMs in the Soviet Union, which of course allows for the possibility of a false alarm, and of alarm of a kind that has happened in a small way, quickly dispelled thousands of times, but very serious ways several times, where it's gotten within seconds or minutes of a presidential decision whether to launch those weapons. To what effect? That's what I want to come to. Now, in short, I'm saying neither party at this moment, and that's to be expected, is offering us any surcease from that threat. Now, in Britain, they face an operational question of what should we do with nuclear weapons, specifically the British Trident weapons. All they have left in the nuclear weapons, they've gotten rid of their bombs, their gravity bombs, their tactical weapons, their cruise missiles. All they have is 4 Trident submarines that are designed by the U.S. essentially, that have missiles that are given by the U.S., Trident II missiles, and warheads that they build, but they build the subs, by the way, too, which is another one reason they don't want to give them up. It's 10,000 jobs are involved. And the warheads are, again, a U.S. design, in effect. So we've, in effect, supported, given them their program. They have 4 Trident submarines, and the question is they're coming to the end of their lives and their reactor lives. Should they spend £100 billion to get 4 new ones? And that came up for a vote just July 11th, less than a month ago. And Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, against his own party's policy, which doesn't want to give away those jobs or raise questions of patriotism, etc. Corbyn says, no, we should not have the Tridents, and he was joined by a minority of his own Labour Party in following that. But the new Prime Minister, Theresa May, in her first parliamentary debate now on July 18th, opened it on the nuclear issue, which she didn't have to do, but she chose that to raise the issue. And she was asked by another party member, Caravan, will she, he says to her, and in Britain, the president, that prime minister has to face questions from their own party and from backbenchers and from the opposition party in a way that our president never has to do. When our president goes before a joint meeting of Congress, you notice there are very unusually one Republican in our new incivility line said, "You lie," at one point, but he doesn't have to answer questions from other officials in Congress, but the Prime Minister does. So the question was asked, a parliamentary system. Prime Minister was asked, is she prepared personally to launch nuclear weapons and kill 100,000 innocent men, women, children? 100,000 innocent men, women, and children. She stepped right up and said, and this is on video, you can see this very easily, yes. And then went on to say, the whole point of a deterrent is that the opponent, the enemy, needs to know that you do have that, you are ready to do that, you are prepared. The question was, is she prepared to do this? Yes. You have to know that you are prepared to do it. Now, that question was not actually, unfortunately, in line with the realities of the nuclear era for the last 70 years, and especially the last half century, in a way that some of you would recognize, but perhaps not all right away. 100,000 innocent men, women, and children? Was she prepared to do that? Well, British and American elected leaders have faced that question in the past and have been tested on it. And they did it. FDR, in March 9th and 10th of 1945, was presided over a policy in which the following action was not even important enough to be brought up to his attention at all. And that was the firebombing of Tokyo by General Curtis LeMay, which incinerated over 100,000 men, women, and children, mostly women and children because the men were overseas in the army, mostly in one night. It was the greatest act of terrorism, the killing of non-combatants for a political purpose in the history of humanity in one night. 80 to 120,000 civilians in one night. Now, as LeMay pointed out, that is more than either of the atomic bombs 5 months later killed individually or even together immediately. What was the response to this particular act, the testing? Did the civilians then say, oh, we didn't know about that beforehand, which is true, don't do it again? By no means. LeMay was not prevented from doing the best he could to reproduce that in every city in Japan. First, all the ones over 100,000 population, and then when he ran out of those, 66 cities in all, some counted 67, 66. He got down to cities of 30,000 and left, killing some 900,000 civilians before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, by the way, honestly, thinking a minute here, to how many people in this very select audience would you say honestly that's news, what you just heard, have not heard that before? Take a look around. That would seem to be most of you, and you're not my age, but you're in the same, some of you in the same ballpark. Americans are not conscious of that bit of history at all. That explains really an issue, the issue of Hiroshima, which has been misunderstood and misconstrued right, left, and center, I would say, for 70 years. The supposed decision to hit Hiroshima and the ethical aspects of it, and why did they do it, and why did they do it now? There was no opposition whatever. There were people in the military and elsewhere who said afterwards it was not necessary. In fact, 4 of the 5 five-star generals all said it had not been necessary. Marshall was the only one who thought it might have been. But beforehand, none of them told the president not to do it, and there was no basis. It was not a moral decision in August 6th, 1945. It was an attempt to kill as many people as possible with one bomb, indeed, and for the first time in human history that was possible. But we had been doing that for 5 months before that, every day, every other day, killing as many civilians as possible, and indeed the Tokyo firestorm was the most effective. If you accepted Tokyo and all the others, there was no moral issue raised at all, and none was discussed. There was no opposition. There was not a decision to be made about Hiroshima. Should we do it with one bomb instead of 300 bombers? Sure, why not? But on the other hand, we had 300 bombers, and we continued to use them. The last raid of the war was a 1,000-plane raid while that returned as the Japanese were surrendering on August 15th. Now, I'm sorry? Well, yes, Dresden. So I'm saying now that that's Americans. But of course, they were following in the footsteps of the RAF, which had been doing this same effort of trying to create a firestorm every time from, not from the very beginning, but from February 1942. The order was to fire and destroy by fire German cities, as many as possible. Only twice did they get major firestorms like Tokyo. That was Hamburg and Dresden, smaller ones in Kassel and Darmstadt. Firestorms, I won't go into that, except to mention that a firestorm is something that a nuclear weapon, even a small one, creates every time. So, in short, when it comes to killing 100,000, which, by the way, the British never succeeded in doing, as we did with B-29s in Tokyo, killing 100,000 in one night, but not because they weren't trying. They were trying to create a firestorm every time. Harder to do it in Germany, where the houses were brick and mortar and a little further apart than the paper and bamboo houses very close together and Tokyo. So they didn't get it. Is she then prepared? Yes, just like Churchill, just like the wartime heroes and so forth, just like the Americans. Yes, I would do that. Why not? Except she's talking about nuclear weapons. Corbyn pointed out that the Trident submarines, which are capable of being loaded with far, far more weapons than they actually are now under New START agreements, which limit them to 8. Well, actually, they have only about 3 warheads per missile, 8 missiles per submarine, 1 submarine on all the time. So that would be 40 warheads from 1 Trident submarine. He pointed out, he said, we're talking here about not 100,000, 1 million deaths. Actually, that's low. If they concentrated, as they might or might not, part of the planning, all of those 40 warheads on the, which are, by the way, 100 kiloton warheads, he pointed out that each of them is 8 times the Hiroshima weapon in yield, and the Hiroshima weapon killed between 80 and 140,000, well, 140,000 up to 200,000 if you figure up till 6 months with fallout, with the casualties from radiation. So he said, here's, each one is 8 times that, and you have 40 of them on a, well, a calculation made in Britain of what 1 submarine would do just in the Moscow area if they hit 16 command and control centers in Moscow, which are definitely targeted, both by the Americans and the British and the French. But if they went in Moscow, you would kill 3.5 million people. And if they spread them out for population damage, these are against hardened silos, hardened bunkers. If you spread them out, it would be much more than that. So 100,000 is not what we're talking about in the nuclear era. How would she have answered if the question had been more realistic? Is the Prime Minister prepared to kill several million people with 1 Trident submarine? And by the way, you know, cause a war which would very clearly, if it hadn't already been a total U.S. nuclear war. Well, officially, I don't know, you know, what could she do without changing her policy other than again to say yes. Is it plausible that she would have said it quite as thoroughly as you'll see her say 100,000? Watch on the video, easy to find. Question would have been, is the lady prepared, as they say in Parliament, to launch a strike that would kill 100 million people? Add 3 zeros to the question she was asked. Well, now you're in the ballpark on nuclear weapons. It's a little hard to imagine that she would say that quite as, yes. What do you do with that? I sent a question in my old war criminal days when I was working for the Defense Department, RAND contractor in '61, later an official. But I wrote a question for the SecDef, which actually, to send to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which was actually picked up by the Deputy Assistant for National Security, McGeorge Bundy's deputy, Bob Comer, an old friend of mine, who saw some questions that I had drafted, and he chose one to send in the name of the President to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the spring of 1961, when I was just after I would turn 30. It was a question, it led to an answer, which in effect changed my life, or my sense of humanity and where we are and what our predicament is. The question was, brief account of this, the question was to the Joint Chiefs, if your war plans for general nuclear war are carried out as planned, meaning there's no divine wind that somehow gets in the way, or they all fail, or doesn't get through, if they reach their targets, how many people will be killed in the Soviet Union and China? And I chose that question, actually, in those narrow terms, because our plans were actually designed for the Sino-Soviet bloc, including the Warsaw Pact countries, but I asked only for the Soviet Union and China, in the false belief that they didn't have a calculation, and I wanted to embarrass them on this particular point, but I was wrong. They came right back with a chart, straight line chart, with millions of deaths on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis, month by month, to take account of fallout casualties that would increase over time. As I said, in Hiroshima, you had about 85,000 immediately, and another 40,000 within months from radiation. Okay, so how many then? They wanted to tell me over time. And the answer was a straight line starting on the vertical axis in the first hours or minutes and going up with the fallout. And what do you think the immediate deaths that the Joint Chiefs reported to Kennedy were if their plans were carried out on his order? Let me hear a guess.
80 million.
What? 8 million? 80 million? Yeah, 80 million? Okay, well, the answer was 275 million, going up to 325 million, 50 million more over 6 months. 50 million more over 6 months. Well, since they had an answer, and they obviously had a crude model on this, linear, we sent another question then, okay, how many altogether? And this time, effects of your strikes. And this time, it wasn't a graph, it was a table with the different countries involved. And roughly, but fairly good approximation to say, the answer was that in the Warsaw Pact, it would be another 100 million. These are the captive countries, Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc., the countries that are now in NATO. Another 100 million in West Europe, our NATO allies, from fallout, no warheads falling on them at all from us, but from fallout depending on the winds, which mainly depended on the season. And without regard for the season, a third 100 million in contiguous areas like northern India, Afghanistan, Finland, wiped out by fallout directly in Finland from ground attacks, ground bursts on the submarine pens in Leningrad near Helsinki. So in all, another 300 million for a total of 600 million, or 100 holocausts from our strikes. Now that was underestimated because, as Lynn Eden and others have shown, up till the present, they don't take into account the effect of fire, which is the major casualty-producing effect of thermonuclear weapons, which is what we're talking about. Why not fire? Because it's too hard to calculate. It depends on weather, it depends on the materials, like they say between Germany and Japan. Too hard to calculate. That's not true, but if you put fire in, you'd need less weapons to do the massacre. So they don't include fire. Add that and you're up to 1 billion. And the population of the world at that time was 3 billion. But that hasn't allowed for Russian response. And the Russian medium-range and short-range missiles aimed at Europe would have annihilated Europe to the tune of 100 million, whatever the weather. Still, possibly very few or none or 10 million deaths in America for that time. At that time, the Russians, I'm giving a short lecture here, but on this point, but 4 ICBMs, so the chance that they could do much to the U.S. was very small. But what they didn't know then, and didn't know for another 20 years, was the smoke from the cities we were burning, and we targeted every city in Russia, over 100,000 population. It was 211 cities then, plus a lot of lower cities. The smoke from that would be lofted by the firestorms created by this, and a firestorm, unlike a normal fire, creates enormous updrafts that send the smoke up into the upper stratosphere, where it's warmed and stays even longer, and as we now know, stays for more than a decade, blocking out sunlight to the point that all harvests are killed. Lakes are frozen if it's in the summer or in the winter. Mass starvation, and I don't mean just large starvation. I mean everybody, almost everybody. As Alan Robach and other scientists who worked on this in the last 10 years say, probably some Americans would remain, not Americans, some humans would remain living on fish and mollusks somewhere. We're so adaptable, we can move anywhere where there's food, we can get along anywhere. And maybe there would be 100,000 or 1 million or 10 million. Maybe there would be 100 billion, but not 1 billion. And there's 7 billion of us now. So what we're talking about when we talk, as both sides are talking now, this is new, because Russia is now as weak compared to NATO conventional forces as NATO used to be compared to Soviet forces. So they're relying on first use now, like the Eisenhower New Look. And they're talking about it. And they're talking about putting weapons in Kaliningrad and so forth, which is their little enclave, their little Berlin inside NATO territory, essentially, to keep them out. Okay. Both sides now are refusing to rule out, so far, first use of nuclear weapons against each other. Ukraine is offering a possibility now, if Trump had been had failed in his effort with the Republican committee, the Republican Party platform would call for giving lethal aid to Kiev. In order to get a war started more in Kiev, get them take out their eastern regions, put them under Kiev control, and NATO control totally, which is a war issue for Russia. So the possibility that even though Ukraine isn't in NATO, that NATO would be drawn in to a war with Russians, and that would include American troops, is a real possibility now for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, more than half a century ago. We are facing the possibility of that, with both sides saying, and if necessary, we are prepared, and that means we're deploying weapons, we are training, we're exercising the possibility of initiating nuclear war. The Russians have had an exercise in the last year, which escalated on their side, we were watching, to the point of their dropping a nuclear weapon on Warsaw. Insane, like our plans have always been. That's been our NATO planning from start to finish and still is. We're talking about doing nothing other than ending most humanity and all civilization. Now, okay, I haven't gotten to the good news, right? All right. Thanks to Trump and no other, astonishingly, because he was asked the questions like Theresa May that the others haven't been asked in the past. And he gave not his own idiosyncratic, insane, weird, fanatic, ideological, racist, misogynistic answers as usual, but he just gave the answers that every Democratic and Republican president or candidate, major candidate, not one-percenters that I support like Kucinich, would have given. Or Sanders, and not a 1%. First one we've seen was, since McGovern, who wasn't a 1%er. And I'm sure Sanders would not have given that answer, but he lost. It's raised the issue, and now here's the rather astonishing thing. Just a week ago, the New York Times, which I recommend to you looking at, had an editorial that I have not seen that I can remember ever, calling for, considering, and in favoring the elimination of our ICBM force, our leg of the triad, Not only the long-range standoff missile, the air-launched cruise missile, which there's a lot of opposition to, except by the people who are making it, the odds are that they will succeed and that it will be made. Has a lot of opposition. The ICBMs, as I say, ending launch on warning. Actually, you can do that from one day to the next. The president can say, we will not launch on warning, and he should do that. And also consider no first use. Okay. Now, the Wall Street Journal revealed what's the date here? August 12th. August 12th. No first use nuclear policy proposal assailed by cabinet officials and allies. Well, that refers to the fact, it confirms what Bruce Blair, a real expert, former Minuteman control launch officer, has been saying for some time, to my surprise, that Barack Obama actually favored, from the beginning of his term, no first use, sole use. We will not use nuclear weapons except in retaliation to nuclear force. It's a possibility we will do it we're prepared to do it if they attack first. And remember, even that, which would have the support of most Americans, to say we will respond to an attack or are prepared to do that, says nothing other than if we are attacked with nuclear weapons, and it doesn't say how large or what it is, the president is prepared to end civilization and end most human life on Earth. It's a doomsday machine. That's what we've had, and it's what we've had for over 50 years. It's what the Russians have. Now, it may or may not be insane or immoral. It's a question to threaten to do something that would clearly be immoral to carry out. It may be effective. You may feel you have no alternative, but it does deserve a close look as to whether you have an alternative or whether this is necessary. And in this case, our defense and our candidates are committed to saying not only that we would do it second, which most Americans would agree, but that we could do it first. And do what? Respond, retaliate. Or, to spell that out a little bit, unpack that, we're prepared to end human life, most of it on Earth, and make nearly every primate, every vertebrate extinct, because they are not as adaptable as this exceptional species. They can't move from pole to pole, or from pole to equator, or wherever, the way we can. They don't use fire, they don't use clothing, they don't have houses. Land animals on the whole don't fish, etc. They die. They become extinct, sixth grade extinction. And we become nearly extinct. So that's what we're paying taxes for, that's what we're preparing for, the maintenance of two doomsday machines. But why is it on the front page? Because Trump scared people by being asked and giving the standard answer, sounded crazy, and it's coming from a crazy man who, you figure whatever the policy, we don't want him in control, but raising the issue and revealing for the first time in the Wall Street Journal that we have a president who actually has actually not only considered but favored changing that. Not the second use part, but the first use part, and the ICBMs, and the launch on warning. Hold on. News. That it really is news. Asked me that 6 months before. No. Why hasn't he done it? The Wall Street Journal now comes out with why, and it's the answer that Bruce Blair gave earlier. He's strongly opposed by his Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, and this is news to me from this, which I just read yesterday, Secretary of State John Kerry, and Secretary of Energy, who's in charge of the warheads, building nuclear weapons, Ernest Moniz. And they could have said the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is certainly true, as well as by allies in Europe. It turns out that the UK, France, Japan, and South Korea have expressed reservations about no first use. And I said to myself at first, England, France, what do they care? They're not under our umbrella. They have their own nuclear weapons. And then I thought immediately of the answer. Because they have a first use policy, as Theresa May has just confirmed. Corbyn, no. May, yes. And so they don't want it. Well, faced with that, and I'll come close to the end with this, faced to that, the way to bet for presidents of the last 50 years would be it virtually unthinkable that he would go against his allies, against his three major secretaries, and his national security assistant on this, just because he realizes that what we're threatening is insane. You know, insane how? Just in a a small way, the way that Trump is generally insane, as we can all see. No, Trump on this point is insane the way our policy has been insane for 70 and particularly for 50 years, and particularly since the end of the Cold War 30 years ago. And since we discovered nuclear winter, a whole new degree of insanity, which we managed to deny the way cigarette smoking was denied, the way ozone was denied, and the way all these things were denied. Managed to deny for about 20 years, but in the last 10 years, nuclear winter now, in the last 10 years, the scientists have come back, say, well, our models are now much stronger, much definite. All the uncertainties went the bad way. Carrying out these plans kills nearly everybody, our own people. Those are our plans. Okay. I'm saying it appears that there is a chance that the president in his remaining 5 months, just as he could, what does he have to lose? Just as he certainly could pardon Chelsea Manning and Sterling and Kiriakou. In theory, he could pardon Snowden. I'm saying that's at a lower level of impossibility. But he could say launch on warning, no launch on warning tomorrow. He could say we are going to save $100 billion over the next 10 years by eliminating our ICBMs, basically. He should cut back the submarine program so that he could say that. Yes, it can be reversed by his successor. I would say what my dream would be, and it's now not in the level of, let's say, a carbon tax in the next 5 months, which we should do, or or in the next term. I don't see that happening. There are things that are essential that look very, very low. But thanks to this, I have some hope now in the for the first time, that with enough public pressure of this kind, and by the way, now I want to bring to your attention this morning's New York Times. Has anybody, who has seen that already? Anybody? You've been here. To my astonishment, I saw 2 pages here that I haven't seen ever. In response to the editorial, which was a response to Trump, there are terrific letters from authorities. A number of them I know. Ira Helfand of PSR, David Keppel, who's been at this for half a century, Elizabeth Gronlund of a Union of Concerned Scientists, announcing, strongly endorsing precisely what the New York Times raised as a possibility and what should be done. No launch on warning, no get rid of the ICBMs, no first use, no long range. Okay, strong argument. Zenley wrote, I'm embarrassed to say, I thought of writing stuff like that, haven't done it yet. And then on the other page, end the first use policy for nuclear weapons. As well and argued a case for this as I've ever seen. It's by the Bruce Blair that I mentioned earlier, who was a Minuteman launch control officer, and James Cartwright, who was known earlier as Obama's favorite general. He was the commander of the Strategic Command, formerly the Strategic Air Command, and vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, calling for no first use and the elimination of ICBMs on this. This is now, this is a message for both, first of all, it somewhat answers the question, that Trump was raising, actually. Why not, and why make them, and should we do this? It's a message for Hillary Clinton, which I frankly do not expect her at all to respond to directly in her policies. But it's a mission to Barack Obama, who apparently agrees with every one of these issues. And he is the president. He is not running for re-election. It is hard to explain why he's gone along as much as he has for this, although one simple answer would be that no president wants to have his Secretary of Defense resign or the Joint Chiefs of Staff and disagree with him. And maybe he won't even do it during this campaign in November, but that leaves him 2 months, almost November, December, January, 3 months almost, to do something, and he could do it right now as an answer to Trump. Trump has raised these issues. I'll give you the right answer. This, I think, deserves, not because it's high likelihood, it's not. Given that opposition, and given the military-industrial complex opposition, the people who build these weapons and rely on it, which is the major issue. You know, when Scotland went against the Tridents, where they're based in Scotland, but also they're against, as Corbyn put it, I will not order the deaths of millions of innocent people. And the Scottish agree with that. And do you know what the new Prime Minister's answers to the Scots who had voted for abandoning Trident was immediately afterwards? One thing. Not, you're wrong, or misguidance. You have just lost, you have voted to lose thousands of jobs in Scotland. It's like saying, you shouldn't close Auschwitz for the jobs in the village that are maintained and keeping it in working order in case it might be used sometime. To talk of these weapons, I say weapons, to talk of these warheads, these devices as weapons, is like talking about Auschwitz as a weapon of war. When I said 900,000 Japanese civilians killed before Hiroshima, add to that 300,000 over the next several months from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 1.2 million people. That's just about what Auschwitz killed in the way of innocent civilians, Auschwitz itself, out of the 6 million. Okay, so we're dealing with not only a moral issue, but an existential issue, not in a rhetorical sense, but if existential means anything at all for our species. We're talking then about self-extinction, or near extinction, to be very precise. Okay, we have a chance to speak up. I asked how many veterans were not lied into war. Well, I didn't see any. I saw one hand. 2 hands, okay. Good. A lot of veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan do not believe they were lied into war. They're mistaken. I'm sure most of them, nearly all of them, were very brave over there. They did what they thought was right, and they still think it was right. And apparently they still believe, this is what polls show, that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11, that he was allied with Al-Qaeda, and that they were protecting American lives by the risks they were taking and the people they were killing. But actually, they're mistaken. In none of these wars, I would say, none, including Korea, since the Second World War, could it be said that our truly brave soldiers, men and women that we were sending over there, were acting to preserve American freedom, as we always hear, or to preserve American lives. It's not been true. And it won't be true in Syria or Iraq and Somalia. I'm saying, finally, on this issue, how can it be changed? I'll make, say, 2 minutes here. A lot of people here, how many people were in a firefight in your experience? Have had weapons that you could hear were aimed at you or near you, as I had actually in Vietnam. You know that in those situations, you look around and you're seeing courage everywhere you look, on both sides actually, if you think about it, but certainly among your own troops. The exhilaration of it is, if there is any, actually Churchill, when he was a young man, said, Nothing in life is so exhilarating as to be shot at without result. Well, actually, other things are more exhilarating than that. But I can say that. But what is exhilarating is to know that you're among people who would risk their lives for yours if you were wounded, and to know that you would do it for them, and that they're able and you are able in a situation of great danger and stress to act competently, to do a job, to do what you're supposed to do. That is a very exhilarating and gratifying experience. Very few people have that under the same circumstances in peacetime. Actually, police, in terms of danger of like firemen, fire jumpers, and so forth. Emergency room people maybe are in a plague. But it is. I'm saying right now, we have a chance to act on impulses in humanity that are quite different from the destructive ones, different from the proclivities and the capabilities in humans that are leading us to extinction, near extinction, and to the others. We can act differently. We can act on moral courage, a willingness to go against the tide, and we can finally seek to give President Barack Obama in his last 5 months in office the support and encouragement of the kind of courage in facing down his own establishment cabinet secretaries, courage that he has not shown up till now, that would indeed earn him the Nobel Prize that he was given so prematurely.
In recognition of and the respect that we have for Daniel Ellsberg, we have a couple of tokens of our appreciation. We want to present to you, this is a Veterans for Peace plaque. These are made by children in Hanoi City who are victims of Agent Orange and others, and they have made these plaques for us. We've been giving them to our speakers, so we'd like to give this to you, Dan, as a token of our appreciation. And also, you talk about our struggle with nuclear weapons. This is the book called The Voyage of the Golden Rule. Now, I don't know if you know the Golden Rule. Anyway, the Golden Rule, our boat, is sailing against and educating against nuclear weapons in the Puget Sound and on a 5-month tour to the Northwest. This is the story of the original founders of the Golden Rule. Albert Bigelow, who was the captain, The Voyage of the Golden Rule, An Experiment with Truth. And many of you know that even though they were imprisoned in Honolulu, the struggle that they started was a worldwide protest against atmospheric testing, and it resulted in 1963 of President Kennedy, the UK, the Soviet Union signing the Partial Test Ban Treaty. But that boat now is by Veterans for Peace, and that's the story, and I think you'll enjoy it. Dan, thank you very much. We appreciate so much your work for Veterans for Peace.